Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar today, Best Practices in Planning and Procuring Solar PV Operations and Maintenance. The presenters for today will be Kevin Watson and myself, Billie Holecek. We're both research associates on the Renewables acquisition team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Today, we will be discussing background on this initiative, the importance of O&M and understanding system performance and key performance indicators, and then getting into the bulk of today's webinar, common barriers and solutions, and resources and tools that can be used to overcome the identified barriers. At the end, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes to answer any questions you may have. During the webinar, there will also be 2 polls to help us understand your needs and some barriers that you may be facing with implementing operations and maintenance for solar PV on your organization sites. These polls will pop up in the Zoom webinar platform, and when they do, make sure you take some time to answer them. So before we get into the background on this webinar, I want to talk about our 2 funders for this research. Our first is Empower Procurement, which is a procurement assistance program funded by the California Energy Commission. This program aims to increase the adoption of clean energy technologies while also reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And through this program, there are 6 initiatives offered: e-fleets, products, services, contracting, benchmark, and DER, or Distributed Energy Resources Consulting. The Berkeley Lab team leads the contracting and consulting initiatives. Our second funder is the Department of Energy's Federal Energy Management Program. This is a broad-based program that's aimed at helping federal agencies meet their energy and sustainability goals through various efforts like on-site distributed energy implementation, performance contracting, fleet electrification, and resilience. Kevin and I both work to support FEMP by providing technical and procurement expertise to federal agencies. So let's talk a bit about how this initiative got started. We started this based on work done with Department of Energy's Federal Energy Management Program, or FEMP, which was focused on evaluating performance of existing solar PV systems in the federal sector and trying to understand how to apply practical solutions to some issues. With over 3,000 PV systems installed on federal sites, it is imperative to understand how these assets are performing, and that's where the Federal PV Performance Initiative came into play. From this effort, tools and resources were created from the lessons learned, and the results from the Federal PV Performance Initiative are to be published in a forthcoming FEMP report that evaluates the performance of 75 federal PV systems. There have been a variety of issues and solutions discovered, many of which we will discuss later on in the webinar, and the main one is implementing O&M best practices as a method to improve system performance. Prior to completing this research, we hypothesized that the need for O&M may not be specific to just the federal sector. And to understand if this was accurate, we conducted structured interviews with public sector entities, including federal, state, higher education, and K-12 institutions with PV systems ranging from 65 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. And based on these conversations, we confirmed that these issues and solutions are not just unique to the federal sector, but to the whole realm of public sector entities as well. Now, to get a bit of background information on why you are all joining us today, we want to know what is the top reason you want to implement a solar PV O&M program within your organization. You should see a poll popping up on your screen now, and I'll give you all a couple seconds to answer this. So it looks like there's a lot of different reasons for everyone being here today, including some things for financial return, increasing overall system performance, and the lifespan of the system. So I'll give you all a couple more seconds to answer this. So you should all be able to see the poll results on the screen. So it looks like we have a lot of reasons that people want to implement a solar PV O&M program, and that is great to hear. I'm now going to pass it over to Kevin to talk about the importance of PV O&M.
Great, thank you, Billy. So the first question I want to ask ourselves is, why should we care about O&M for solar PV systems? There are several reasons why, some of which may be obvious and others not so obvious. So the first reason is that an effective O&M plan can increase overall system performance and reduce the amount of time that the system is offline. It can also increase the lifespan of the system from 25 to 30 plus years. An effective O&M plan can also ensure that the system owners achieve the maximum financial return on their investment. It can be very successful at identifying potential safety risks, something which I will discuss in more detail in a moment. A system owner can also use an O&M plan to keep PV equipment like inverters and modules within warranty compliance, as well as enhance the overall appearance and aesthetics of the system. So since we just learned why we should care about O&M for our PV systems, let's discuss what happens when we don't care about it. So this first picture here shows a storm-battered array in the Bronx, New York, where a complete lack of maintenance has allowed the modules to warp, the conduit trays to break free from high wind events. Now keep in mind that in areas that experience high wind events, especially in densely populated areas like the Bronx, this equipment can become airborne and potentially cause harm to people and infrastructure. So here's a picture of a melted module connector. Now this issue is the basis behind a major lawsuit between Walmart and Tesla for several rooftop PV related structure fires. Incompatible materials in these connectors is typically the main culprit. However, with regular visual and thermal imaging inspections, this problem could have been avoided altogether. Now here's an example of how a poorly designed PV array has led to significant degradation of the system. There's no way that a technician can access the middle part of the array without walking on the modules, which is something that we highly emphasize should never be done. In addition to the design, a lack of proper maintenance has led to large amounts of weed growth between the modules. And this last picture is of a roof-mounted array with extremely poor wire management. The plastic wire ties used during installation have long been broken, allowing energized conductors to lay against the roof and move around with any wind forces. Worst case scenario is one of these wires is compromised, which can lead to electrical faults and arcing. This is very dangerous and just another issue that could easily be avoided with an O&M plan in place. I'm not showing these pictures to make everyone run from the hills from solar PV systems, but it's really just to drive the point home that significant safety issues can arise without proper O&M. And all of these issues could be very easily avoided with a good O&M plan in place. And that's a point that I think can be really effective in persuading upper management and staff in charge of maintenance budgets to allocate funding to solar PV O&M. Now I want to talk about system performance and different key performance indicators that can be used to understand how well your system is performing. So the first key performance indicator, or KPI, is availability. Now this is the measured or actual number of hours that the PV system is producing energy divided by the modeled or expected number of hours of system production. The second key performance indicator is performance ratio, or PR. Now this is the actual energy production divided by the expected energy production. So in simpler terms, it's what your system gave you divided by what you thought your system would give you. The third key performance indicator is energy ratio, or ER. This is the actual energy production divided by the expected energy production, and it also includes the effects of availability and performance ratio in the same metric. So there have been several studies done analyzing various performance ratio averages for different PV system sizes. One of the studies analyzed 250 systems, which added up to about 157 megawatts. So from this, we can infer that these were mostly small to large commercial systems, similar to the assets owned by the folks here today. The calculated average performance ratio of the sample size was 93.5%. Another study from the Open Solar Performance and Reliability Clearinghouse, or OSPARC for short, analyzed 2,200 systems installed around California. They calculated an average weather-corrected performance ratio of 91.7% from the sample. Performance ratios of 90% plus are not only desirable, but achievable as well. It is worth noting that performance ratios like these cannot be achieved without an effective O&M plan in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about FEM's Federal PV Performance Initiative, as Billy mentioned before. A few years ago, FEM started the Federal PV Performance Initiative, which analyzed the performance of 75 on-site solar PV systems installed at federal sites. From this, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Berkeley Lab, in support of FEM, produced a report highlighting the process and results using availability, performance ratio, and energy ratio as their performance metrics. So these results can be used for two main purposes. The first one is for asset owners to have a point of comparison to evaluate their performance to other systems' performance. Even though an individual system has its own unique characteristics, it is helpful for system owners to benchmark performance to a sample size similar to the one in the FEM report. The second purpose is to help create realistic performance expectations in future feasibility studies that assess the potential for new solar installations. Going into a new project with a better understanding of what to expect from your system will be helpful and likely prevent system owners from trying to achieve a 100% energy yield, something that is unrealistic or at the very least prohibitively expensive. And so one of the participants of the PV Performance Initiative was the General Service Administration's Mickey Leland Federal Building in Houston, Texas. This site has a 192 kilowatt carport PV system located adjacent to the building that has been operating for a little over 5 years. So in this graph, you can see the total daily measured production in the darker shade compared to the total daily estimated production in the lighter shade. So as I mentioned before with performance metric like performance ratio, the darker shade is what your system actually gave you, and the lighter shade is what you thought your system would give you. So if you look at the beginning of 2018, you can see that the darker shade starts to drop off significantly. Because the site had monitoring in place, they were able to identify an issue with one of the inverters and work with an O&M contractor to diagnose and fix the issue. Once the issue was fixed, the system returned to normal production, as indicated by the closer matchup between the darker and lighter shades in the graph. And one thing to note is that since there were two inverters and only one of them went down, the system was able to generate at about half of the expected production. This might deceive some people into thinking that the system is still generating as expected and that the drop in production is from a few cloudy days. It might also go unnoticed if no one in an organization is really paying attention to the system's performance. It's really important for anyone in your organization to notice these anomalous drops in production like we have in this graph here. So the next poll question we're going to ask is, what is the top challenge in successfully implementing an O&M plan? So we have a couple choices: cost, budgeting complications, time, lack of staff, and monitoring issues. So we'll just take a little bit, give everyone a moment to answer the question. Looks like we got a wide range of answers. There's a kind of almost a three-way split between cost, budgeting complications, and lack of staff. Great, we'll give it another 10-15 seconds to answer. Okay, it looks like lack of staff took the lead. All right, awesome. So yeah, it looks like we had almost a tie between cost and lack of staff, followed by budgeting complications, monitoring issues, and time. Great. So now I'm going to hand it over to Billie to talk about common barriers and solutions.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So after our interviews, we identified three main areas where some common barriers occur, and that's organizational barriers, financial barriers, and technical barriers, similar to what we saw in the results of that poll. So I'll first be discussing the organizational barriers as well as some solutions that can be used to overcome them, and then I'll be passing it over to Kevin to discuss the financial and technical barriers and solutions. So one of the most common barriers we heard when talking with public sector institutions is that there's often a lack of clarity within an organization on what should be included in an O&M plan to fit the needs of the organization and the system installed on their site. There are many ways to overcome this barrier, and one that we suggest is to first engage with various team members and decision makers that are relevant to the project, and to then use existing resources to help create a comprehensive O&M plan. So one of the resources that we suggest using is the National Renewable Energy Lab's Guide of Best Practices for Operation and Maintenance of Photovoltaic and Energy Storage Systems. This guide is very comprehensive and can help organizations plan each step along the way. And because it's so comprehensive, it's also pretty long. So we're going to break down some of the sections and how they can be used to help your organization. So section 3 is scope and prerequisites for a successful O&M program. And this includes some helpful information regarding how to create an O&M plan for your organization. This section can be used to help define the scope during the design, engineering, and construction phases, as well as being used for existing systems. It includes helpful tips like selecting low or no maintenance alternatives when available and making use of network connected inverters for things like remote testing and software configuration, as well as additional tips. Section 5 then discusses dependencies that influence an O&M plan, like the type of systems and components used, location of the system and climate, as well as other environmental conditions, such as your system being located in an agricultural versus an urban setting. And based on these dependencies, your needs for an O&M plan will be different than a system with different configurations. So this guide can help your organization figure out what will work best for you. Section 6 then discusses system performance and key performance indicators. So this is pretty similar to what Kevin discussed previously on how to measure and benchmark your system's performance to understand how it's currently performing and the level it should actually be performing at. This section can help PV system users answer questions like, is system performance monitored and recorded? Does the monitoring supplier provide forecasting? And are corrective maintenance response times specified in the contract? Section 7 then discusses health and safety, specifically how to help mitigate risks and decrease the chance of any safety issues through the use of things like controlling access to the site, verifying that areas with hazards have clear and evident signage, and ensuring that all site personnel are equipped with complete PPE for the task on hand, as well as some additional guidance. Section 8 then discusses O&M provider qualifications and responsibilities. The service provider qualifications include things like hiring a licensed electrical contractor, making sure they have experience with on-power generation systems, and experience with medium voltage DC electrical systems, as well as some other requirements. This section and other sections in this guide also provide helpful checklists. In this one specifically, there's a checklist regarding provider qualifications, as well as insurance needs that your organization can use. Section 9 includes information regarding system monitoring, software solutions, and data management. For system monitoring, there are 3 main areas of best practices: data presentation, quality of monitoring equipment, and transparency of measurement protocols and procedures. Now, data analysis is a very powerful tool that can be used to help understand system performance, but it's also ultimately determined by the quality of the monitoring system that you use. So it's first important to procure a quality monitoring system, and then to implement secondary checks when feasible to ensure accuracy of the monitoring. This resource helps to guide system owners and O&M providers on how this can be done, as well as some monitoring errors to be on the lookout for. Data management is also important to ensure the system monitoring data is accurately represented, and enterprise asset management platforms can assist with this by enabling tight resource control to help optimize O&M costs. Again, throughout the section, there are some helpful checklists that can be used to ensure accurate system monitoring and data management. Section 10 then discusses O&M implementation strategies, which is our main topic for today, and the choices for resourcing O&M. There's 3 choices. One is using the engineering, procurement, construction, or EPC company, or the installer who built and warrants the system. The second is bringing the O&M services in-house, and the third is outsourcing the services to a specialized third-party O&M provider. A mix of these 3 strategies can be used depending on the system or organization needs, and many organizations actually use a mix of these strategies depending on their system and also their employee capability. If you're using a mix of these strategies, it's important to have a plan for in-house versus third-party O&M work defined prior to when any issue may arise to ensure any downtime within the system is minimal. Section 11 then discusses estimating PV O&M costs. This section is majorly based on the Nrel cost calculator for PV O&M that contains a list of different O&M measurements and estimates. This resource is publicly available to help estimate your organization's PV O&M costs. So you can see on the left here the cost calculator referenced in the best practices guide. And like I said before, it includes a variety of inputs like system size, location, array type, installed cost, number of strings, combiner boxes, and DC disconnects, number and type of inverters, and environmental conditions. This calculator also helps to break down the yearly costs and the net present value of O&M services, such as module cleaning, vegetation management, inspection and monitoring, equipment component replacement, module and inverter replacement, and operations administration. This tool is great to help estimate the costs you can expect to go towards O&M at your organization. And to get access to this resource, please email Andy Walker from the National Renewable Energy Lab at andywalker@nrel.com. His email is available in the slide, which will be shared after today's webinar, and will also be sent in chat. The final part of this guide that we'll be reviewing is Appendix E, which includes examples of scope of work documents that can be used to help guide the system buyers when procuring O&M services. As you can see, this is a very comprehensive document to help guide you through procuring O&M services and can be used in a way that works best for your organization. Another similar resource is the Operations and Maintenance for Optimal Photovoltaic System Performance webinar. Similar to what we did today, this webinar helps to walk through the O&M best practices guide and break down the different sections for organizations. In the screenshot here, you can see that the webinar helps to answer important questions for things such as module cleaning and how often it should be done based on site conditions. This is a 5-hour webinar that's broken down into 4 different sections, including PV O&M, scope of activities, plan elements, and warranties. The second section is dependencies on system size, type, site, and environmental conditions. The third is service provider responsibilities, including health and safety, system monitoring, and O&M supporting systems. And the last one is estimating PV O&M costs. This training outlines the necessary steps for directing ongoing or new operation of PV systems for the life of the project across a variety of different system types, sizes, and environments. It's designed for personnel looking to plan and direct an operations and maintenance program for a variety of PV systems. And if you still have additional questions regarding the guide and how it can be used on your site, I recommend spending some time to watch this training. The next barrier that we heard within our interviews was that there is often a lack of trained in-house maintenance staff available to perform O&M services. And this sometimes makes it so if there is an issue that occurs, the organization has to wait until a third-party O&M provider can come to troubleshoot and fix the issue. If there was in-house staff trained, the waiting time would decrease and the system could go back to performing as expected much quicker. To do this, we recommend training maintenance staff on the basics of O&M services, safety, troubleshooting, and more. One resource available to train your staff is the O&M Best Practices for Small-Scale PV Systems webinar offered through the Whole Building Design Guide. This training covers systems that are 100 kilowatts or less, but it also includes best practices for systems of all sizes. The training provides viewers with great details on how to create an in-house O&M program using your own maintenance staff, and it really gets into the details on all the requirements to start your own O&M program. I highly encourage you all to watch this 1-hour training webinar, as it may answer a lot of your questions on this topic. The learning objectives for the webinar include assessing critical items like system needs and warranty compliance, as well as monitoring requirements to manage assets and plan for a complete O&M program. The next learning objective is identifying preventative maintenance practices necessary to perform on a regular basis. This includes things like module cleanings and visual or thermal imaging inspections of electrical equipment to detect any maintenance issues that may pop up. The third learning objective is identifying and diagnosing corrective maintenance and repair of faulted equipment, such as downed inverters or broken modules. The next objective is to determine and follow proven safety procedures when working with your PV system, similar to what was discussed in the best practices guide, but specific to in-house staff working on a small scale PV system. The final learning objective is understanding the professional qualifications of personnel required to perform work such as proper electrical training or NABCEP certification. And it's important to remember when you're using in-house O&M staff to know what can be handled by your staff and when it's necessary to hire an O&M contractor to help fix specialized equipment. So your staff might be able to handle things like module cleanings and troubleshooting, but if there's an inverter that is down, you may need to outsource the O&M work dependent on in-house staff capabilities. To ensure that this is all done in a timely manner, a plan should be created ahead of time that outlines what O&M work will be done in-house and when to contact your third-party provider for assistance. So the next barrier that was often brought up by the organizations we spoke to is that there's a lack of trained procurement staff and tools or resources to issue contracts. And one way to overcome this is through the use of standardized contracting templates with built-in instructions for easy use. So one example of this is FEMP's Solar PV O&M request for proposal template that you can see on the left side of the screen. This can be used when going out to bid for an O&M provider, and this template is written for use by federal agencies, but it can also be modified for use by other organizations. We also have a generic version available that has the same structure and scope and is linked in our resources slide at the end of the webinar. The RFP template is meant to be used as a customizable template for organizations seeking O&M services for their solar PV systems. Both templates include language covering preventative maintenance for the system, such as inverter and cable inspection, and other requested services that the O&M provider will be responsible for completing. The next section includes corrective services for deferred maintenance issues, such as an inverter that has been down for an extended period of time prior to the procurement of an O&M contract and needs to be replaced to ensure the performance of the system is as expected. It also includes additional services that must be completed by the O&M provider, such as module cleaning, snow and ice removal, and how often that this should be completed. Emergency actions is also included in this RFP, specifically for system owners and the O&M provider to help prevent any injury, damage, or loss to the system and any of the adjacent or adjoining structures. In this section, you can also specify the expected response time for your O&M provider for all emergencies that may occur. The template then covers documentation management, such as including information about what documents need to be accessed, what documents are on hand, and the identification of any additional needed documentation. In this section, you can also specify that the contractor must be able to provide any and all relevant documentation at the request of the system owner. The section Submission Requirements for Bidders includes offers, price worksheets for preventative, corrective, and additional services, as well as business information that is relevant to the project at hand. This begins the evaluation section specific to base year pricing for the previously mentioned services. The next section, Evaluation Criteria, is how an O&M provider will evaluate the contract bids and includes requested information for technical evaluation factors, including things like service capabilities, experience, and past performance, as well as the pricing mentioned in the previous section. The last section is the price bid response document for various maintenance and repair items discussed in the earlier sections of the RFP, such as module cleaning and replacement costs for parts purchased as part of corrective or additional services. This RFP can be modified in ways that work best for the needs of your organization. The next barrier that we identified is that PV O&M services are often not a high priority for an organization's maintenance list. And this is often because the organizations assume that O&M for PV systems will add additional costs. However, that's not accurate. To overcome this barrier, we suggest highlighting that the PV system helps to reduce energy costs and the O&M services end up being self-funded because of the energy that's produced. Kevin will discuss this a bit more in depth a bit later in the webinar. We also heard that cybersecurity constraints can sometimes prevent access to data monitoring. And to overcome this, we suggest first working with your organization's IT or network department to identify the specific constraints for your organization, and then using resources like the Guide to Distributed Energy Resources Cybersecurity Framework and Cybersecurity in PV Plant Operations, both which are linked in the resources section of the webinar today. To look a bit more in depth into one of these resources, here is a screenshot of what the Nrel Distributed Energy Resources Cybersecurity Framework looks like. This framework can help organizations assess the cybersecurity health of their DER systems and can be used by any organization in need by either registering your system or using the anonymous version to assess the health of your system one time. The last organizational barrier is that large organizations sometimes have a decentralized asset management approach, which makes it harder to create an O&M plan. In one of our interviews, we heard how decentralized solar O&M plans made it more difficult to create a standardized approach and financing for O&M on each site. To overcome this, we suggest establishing working groups with a variety of stakeholders like the facility staff and energy and sustainability groups, as well as high-level decision makers to get early buy-in. They can then help to focus on an aggregated effort like a regional or statewide approach, which can help centralize the asset management approach within your organization and help overcome some institutional barriers. So those were all the organizational barriers that we identified, and I'm now going to be passing it over to Kevin to talk about some common barriers and solutions for financials.
Great, thanks, Billy. So one of the most common barriers, financial barriers, is a lack of funding in an organization's general maintenance budget that's allocated to PV O&M. So while no technology exists yet to make money magically appear, one organizational change that can be made is to coordinate between the budgets for facility maintenance and utility expenditures. Avoided utility costs should be used to fund annual maintenance and repairs to your PV system without taking away money from the rest of the general maintenance budget. Another common financial barrier is the fluctuations in annual maintenance budgets. In the federal sector, these fluctuations usually occur from changing administrations that have differing priorities. In other public sector areas like higher education and K-12 school districts, maintenance budgets may be allocated on a full-time student basis. This means that the more students the campus has, the more money is allocated to that particular campus. And on the inverse, if there is a drop in full-time students, organizations will decrease the amount of money that is allocated to that campus, thus potentially impacting the available funds to perform O&M on PV systems. One way to avoid this, and I want to point out that this is for new construction systems, is to use infrastructure or capital bonds to pay for long-term O&M services. So Billy and I spoke to several public sector entities that were able to secure infrastructure bond funding and not only install solar, but they were able to lock down O&M contracts for 5 or 10 plus years with the installer. So another financial barrier that we encountered is the difficulty in presenting the business case to upper management on the benefits of O&M for PV systems. Using available tools like the Nrel PV O&M cost calculator that Billy discussed earlier, it can be simple for organizations to estimate the cost of a potential O&M program. However, understanding the financial benefits of an O&M program and translating that to upper management decision makers can be much more complex. There is always a question as to how much to buy and what is just the right amount. Overspending on O&M may end up outweighing the benefits of it. One solution is to present an analysis of lost savings associated with a decrease in production due to a delayed repair. So this graph here shows the production of 4 PV systems installed at a higher education institution in California. The blue, purple, green, and yellow bars represent different PV systems, varying in size and type. The green line represents the solar irradiance throughout the year, higher in the summer and lower in the winter. Over here in May, you can see a sharp drop in production. You can see a sharp drop in production. That was a result of a broken inverter fan, which caused the system to shut down and led to a significant decrease in production. Now, this delay lasted several months, most of the months which are not represented by this graph. So the table on the top of the graph shows the increased utility cost from the drop in solar production. After less than 2 months, the site had already spent over $15,000 to their serving utility. Now, the kicker of this is that the replacement of the inverter fan only costed about $8,000, meaning the fan had a payback of about 1 month. It was also a significant loss in savings because this occurred during the beginning of the summer when there is maximum solar production. So I like showing this graph because it represents a great visual to present to upper management and the people in charge of maintenance budgets. They can clearly see the lost savings from a drop in solar production and identify a simple payback of replacing a broken component. Another financial barrier is a lack of available funding to repair or replace failed equipment. So one common solution is to set up a reserve account that can be used to fund any repairs or replacements. These reserve accounts should be optimized to predict when a system component, like an inverter, might fail. Common wisdom in the solar industry is that most inverters fail after 10 to 12 years. Organizations can predict these failures like this and ensure that they have enough money for a replacement in their reserve account. Be mindful that there is a threshold in which there's too much money in a reserve account and could be better off spent elsewhere. I would highly recommend reviewing the Nrel Report by Walker et al. Called Model of Operation and Maintenance Costs for PV Systems. It provides a lot of detail on establishing a reserve account, predicting failures of equipment, and ensuring maximum funding for replacement or refurbishment of said equipment. This report is also included in a resources section at the end of the presentation. And so I'm going to go and move on to technical barriers and solutions. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, there have been hundreds of solar installers and product manufacturers that have come and gone in the last 2 decades. Many sites around California sit with modules and inverters and other equipment installed or manufactured by now defunct companies. Oftentimes, it is difficult or near impossible to have these warranties honored. Even when these warranties are honored, they are typically prorated and do not compensate the system owner for labor and overhead. One solution is to hire a company or an O&M provider that specializes in refurbishing or replacing legacy equipment. These companies have access to specialized parts and will provide their own warranties to system owners when they refurbish equipment, knowing that they are taking on the risk and responsibility of the project. The other option, instead of refurbishment, is to do a complete replacement of the equipment. This may be the costlier option, but oftentimes might be an owner's only option to move forward on a project. Another significant barrier that we encountered was a lack of access to the PV system's data monitoring platform. During our interviews, we heard of several reasons why sites lost access to their monitoring, including lost login usernames and passwords, subscription expirations due to a lack of available funding, and organizational cybersecurity protocols not allowing the PV system to connect to the site's internal network. There's a number of avenues that an organization can take. Now, ultimately, the solution that you employ depends on your organization's own internal IT and cybersecurity protocols and the needs for monitoring. It is important that an institution look for a holistic approach and work with multiple stakeholders on identifying potential solutions. And some of the solutions that we learned of in the interviews were to connect the PV system to the site's building management system. And that meant that not only was the energy manager able to look at what was going on with the HVAC, the chillers, lighting, but the solar PV systems as well. Another solution that was employed was installing a clouded monitoring service with a cellular device that was not connected to the site's internal network. And as we've mentioned several times during this webinar, there is a critical need for PV systems to have effective O&M plans in place to ensure a variety of benefits like high performance, reducing safety risks, and ensuring financial returns. Now, all system owners should have O&M plans in place, but I think it'd be disingenuous of us if we said that this was a simple effort for PV system owners to undertake. Some of the public sector organizations that we talked to did not want to start off with creating an O&M plan or didn't know really where to start. So one solution that was employed was to hire an independent consulting firm to conduct a performance analysis and conditions assessment. So this was very similar to the FEMS PV performance initiative. So working with federal agencies to understand the overall performance of their on-site solar PV systems. There are a number of companies out there that do these types of performance analyses and conditions assessments. And so not only can they help determine the overall system performance, but they'll be able to help identify any obvious system needs. So this will help an organization not overspend on O&M services, as well as ensure that they know the conditions of their assets. So what did we learn? We learned that effective O&M plans are critical to improving system performance, reducing safety risks, and ensuring financial return on investment. We learned that there is a lot of barriers in the public sector for O&M uptake, some of which we didn't have displayed up on the slides before, but there were plenty to talk about. But on the positive side, we did acknowledge that there's plenty of resources and tools that exist for public sector use to facilitate the adoption of O&M for PV systems. And with that, we also learned that there's an existing need for even more resources and tools that can cover topics like how to initiate a performance evaluation of your system, how to contract out for a conditions assessment, and so on. And so here's a list of resources and tools that Billie had referenced before. I'm not going to go into every single one, but there are plenty of really great resources here, as well as the ones that we talked about. So on topics like technical procurement specifications for new construction projects, we have information on best practices that address what to do with a PV system when it reaches the end of its life or the end of its performance period. We also have a few resources on severe weather resiliency measures, and I am very, very happy to announce that the PV System Owner's Guide to Identifying, Assessing, and Addressing Weather Vulnerabilities, Risks, and Impacts is now available on the FEMP website. So that's a really great in-depth field guide that you can take out and identify existing vulnerabilities of your system that might become failures from severe weather events like high wind events, flooding, hail, blizzards. And then there's a fact sheet on severe weather that can be really great in implementing best practices for new construction systems. Here's our Berkeley Lab Sustainable Operations website. So as Billie mentioned before, we both work within this group. If you want to check out more of our work and follow us, you can go through to this website, go through the sustainable acquisition portion, and then you'll see a renewables acquisition page, and that has all the information on the work that we do related to new construction projects, procurement issues, operations and maintenance, as well as severe weather. So I'd also like to take a moment to thank all the people that participated in our structured interviews. This webinar was, pretty much built off all of the time and information and input that you all gave, and we really appreciate your time, enthusiasm, and dedication to making the practice of solar PV O&M better. I'd also like to thank the folks from industry that spoke with us and provided some very illuminating information from the provider side. We are planning to host a webinar covering barriers and solutions from the provider side of the business. I highly encourage everyone here to attend that one. We do not have a firm date yet, but we will be sending out information as soon as we do. And lastly, we are committed to providing useful tools and resources for all organizations to make the adoption of solar PV and O&M plans easier. Therefore, we welcome any and all suggestions on additional tools and resources that would be helpful to further improve our offerings. There will be a survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar, as well as one that will be emailed to you after. And with that, Billie and I will be taking any questions that you may have.
Hi, Kevin. This is Ian Hoffman. Thanks very much. And let's roll on into our Q&A. We have a number of questions from our participants. One is, do you tend to see higher, lower, or the same O&M for ground installation systems versus rooftop?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer specifically for the breakdown between roof and ground mount. I think we can say, based on our structured interviews, that there was a big difference in the number of systems that had an O&M plan in place. So if they were, new construction, so within the last 3 to 5 years versus 5 to 10 plus years. I think that the practice of O&M has gotten more widespread throughout the industry. 15, 20 plus years ago, the thought was that PV systems didn't need any O&M. And I think that the industry is still doing a little bit of catch up as far as making sure that every system has a good O&M plan in place. So that's why you see a lot of new construction systems all have O&M contracts, performance guarantees, and a lot of the interviewees we talked to, it was more so their legacy systems that had a lack of O&M and monitoring in place for them.
Terrific, thanks. Now, you might have to translate this one. It's, are there any special LOTO procedures for solar PV maintenance?
I'm gonna assume that that means lockout, tagout. So I would suggest going through the small scale PV or the O&M for small scale PV systems training that Billie went in before. They have an entire section on the lockout tagout process when working with solar and electrical systems. So in order to, I think, get the best information, I would highly encourage you to at least look at that part of the webinar.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I guess this is in reference to the O&M calculator. Is the cost of construction and installation factored into the O&M in the calculation of total cost of ownership?
I believe that the costs are separate, and that that's a good question. I actually don't think I have the answer for you on that one.
Okay, well, we will follow up with the questioner. Some of these questions will follow up directly with the questioner, and some of them we'll go ahead and cover in a follow-up email. I think we've covered this in chat, but we'll also be sharing the slides in that follow-up email, a link to the slides. And when it's available, we will share a recording of this webinar. Another question that has come up is it ever possible to have production if the inverters are not reporting? Or how much of a difference would exist for the meter if the inverters are not reporting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of inverters have their own proprietary monitoring technology, and there are instances where, as I mentioned before, you're monitoring. So whether that's specifically connected to the inverter or if it's a separate meter, the monitoring connection might be broken for whatever reason, whether it's a hardline cable gets severed by an IT technician, or the cybersecurity protocols of your organization block any transmission of data. It's a good question. Ian, do you mind actually saying the question again?
Yeah, sure. Is it possible to have production if inverters are not reporting, and how much of a difference would exist for the meter if inverters are not reporting?
Yeah, I think inverters will still always be reporting data. You might have to go specifically to the inverter and look on like this little LCD screen, and it'll show production of that day, that month, the year, total production of its life. So it's very possible that if your monitoring platform is not registering data from the inverters, it's still possible that the system is producing, that the inverters are still up and running. But that's definitely something that, if that is the case with your system, you should definitely have the system inspected and tested and ensure that the performance is as expected. Because there's always a chance that even if the inverters are still operating, there could be something like, a down string in one of the arrays that's dropping the production, or some other issue that might not necessarily be seen with just looking at the inverter on the LCD screen.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, are most ESPC and UESC funded projects including O&M now? Is that a standard feature?
As far as I know, yes.
Kevin,
my
this
colleague,
is Gerald.
I'll
just say,
Gerald's going to take that.
Yeah, that's pretty common practice. Yeah, that there's some period of O&M that's included in the contract.
Thanks, Joe. One question is, do you suggest a 25-year O&M and performance guarantee, and why or why not? Why if it's a different period?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, if I was a system owner, I'd probably want, I guess it would, a lot of it comes down to available funding. So I think it is very desirable to secure operations and maintenance for the entire life of the system. So whether that's, you know, 25 plus years, I think that is really appealing for a lot of people whose budgets might fluctuate on a year-to-year basis, or, you know, every couple of years. But if I was a system owner, I'd probably want it more on a 5-year basis. So having a 5-year contract with the option of renewing after that, just in case, you know, there's a change in personnel with your O&M provider, or, you know, potentially a drop in quality of the services you're getting, you always have the option of going on or moving on to another O&M provider.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, how easy is it to connect modern monitoring equipment to legacy inverters? That is, maybe those that are, say, 10 years old.
Yeah. Specifically how easy it is.
Yeah, hi, Kevin. This is Gerald. I'll just throw, because I'm actually working on that topic. It absolutely is. Most inverters use a common digital communication protocol, Modbus, BACnet. So they can be integrated into a modern system. So that can be done.
Terrific.
Thanks, Gerald.
Perfect. Here's one. After you've issued an RFP, do you have any suggestions on evaluating the offers and making sure that they can perform? The questioner in this case comes from a small area, wants to be certain that electrical service providers in their area, you know, actually have the expertise to provide the service.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, because you want to make sure that who's ever doing the O&M for your PV system has the qualifications and capabilities to do the work. In the RFP template that Billie was going into before, there is specific information on what to look for in an O&M provider. And, you know, you might want to see if they have licensed electricians on staff, if they're NABCEP certified. NABCEP meaning the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners. They're kind of the standard for solar installers around the country. You know, I definitely will try to get some past performance testimonials from other clients that have a PV system similar in size and scope as yours, as well as ensuring that they have, you know, the financial backing to stay in business for a while. Because like I mentioned before, there's been a lot of contractors and manufacturers over the last few decades that have kind of come and gone pretty quickly. And I'm not entirely sure that is not still the case, but you just really want to make sure that your O&M provider just has like the stability to stay in business, and that you'll be able to work with them for, you know, indefinitely, if you so choose.
Okay. I do want to point out that you know, our renewables acquisition team, which you see here in the webinar, they're standing by in order to help you. So if you have some questions, you know, you'll see some contact information here and also in the follow-up email that we're going to send. And so these folks are standing by and ready to field those questions. And Gerald or Nicole, do you want to touch on what resources are available, what kinds of assistance is available, other kinds of assistance available to federal agencies to help with creating an O&M plan?
This is Gerald. I didn't hear Nicole jump in, so I'll answer that question. Yeah, we have an active program right now, you know, always for funds, contingent on funds availability. that can help agencies put together an O&M plan. And also we have this system evaluation, PV evaluation, performance evaluation that feds may want to avail themselves of. And that's again on case-by-case funds availability, but that's led by Andy Walker, and I think his email was given here. And there's also a technical assistance portal that should have been provided. So if agencies want assistance, they can go to that technical assistance portal, enter a request, and they'll get a quick response.
Okay,
Thanks, Gerald.
thanks very much. Go ahead. Go ahead, Nicole.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add quickly. I'll put that link to the technical assistance portal for federal agencies into the chat. And I also wanted to point out some of the training that Ian linked in the chat throughout the webinar. We have a variety of resources related to PV and also other distributed energy technologies for continuing education unit credit on the whole building design guide website. So I'd really encourage everyone to check those out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. One question we have is, and kind of pertains to maybe some history of inverters not being the most reliable reporting tools, and whether it's better to have some redundant means of reporting. It says, should inverters be one means of reporting and revenue quality meters in parallel?
Yeah, this is Gerald. I'll just jump in on that. And I'm working on a metering project right now related to reconnecting legacy meters, and I'm a big proponent that agencies should have access to an independent meter that they control and can commission and use to watch a system performance, particularly when a system gets large, say something over 100 kW. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of that.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see a couple of other questions. So there's also the Empower Procurement Program, which is a sponsor of this webinar. How do people take part in that program? How can they plug in?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I also work on the Empower Procurement Program as well as Gerald. So if you're interested in getting any assistance on your procurement policies related to sustainability, you can send me an email just asking, and my email is also linked in these slides.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Let me see. We have a couple of questions where people are asking for examples of specific sites. One of them is whether we have examples of sites that have, let's see, where the PV system is connected to the BMS. I think we kind of want to check with those sites before we divulge that, but Gerald, do you want to touch on that one?
Yeah, is the question specifically about the feasibility of connecting metering to a BMS?
No, I think someone wanted some examples, wanted to be able to get in touch maybe with a site that had successfully done that, and or if there are a listing of sites that have managed to do that.
Well, I think the easiest way to get to that answer is maybe contact Honeywell, Johnson Controls, or any other controls company that does a lot of BMS work, and they can give you a sense of the feasibility and give you some examples. I definitely come across that from time to time, and I think it'll probably become more popular in the cyber security laden world we're in. But you know, and that person's welcome to email me offline too, because I can check around for an example.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, some of the people we talked to that did that, one of them, you know, jumps to mind, obviously, because the information that we presented here today is anonymized. I can reach out to the person and see if they'd be willing to willing to discuss with whoever question that was. So please, if you'd like to email me, I can try to connect you with that person. They could probably share some really great insight.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another couple of questions. Do you know of any kind of salient, some important trends in O&M, PV O&M practices and in the market?
Yeah, so one of the ones, actually just in a very recent conversation with an O&M provider, was the cost of solar in the last decade has decreased about 85–90% for installed costs. And with that, the O&M costs were also decreasing as well. I think they've hit a point where it's starting to rebound because O&M costs are based on labor, and unlike mass production of solar technologies, that with that economies of scale, you can reduce the cost of solar technology, but with the cost of labor for people to do the O&M work, I think that has that cost decline has at least stalled and might even be increasing a bit. So that might be something to just keep in mind. But that is also the case with potentially with quality of work. So when you're receiving bids, the lowest priced contractor might not always be the best. You want to go with who's ever adequately addressing the scope of work that you're looking to implement for your PV systems. So that was the one trend that really jumped to mind.
Good. Thanks very much. Let's see. I think we, Nicole, maybe you want to take this. We do take it for the entire audience. We do have a question about whether there are any standing or existing working groups for sharing best practices with O&M plans or services.
Hi, yes, I was just about to type into the chat there. So for federal agencies, we have the Interagency Renewable Energy Working Group. And if you're interested in attending those calls, if you could just send me an email and I'll add you to that list. We discuss a variety of topics that are related to renewable energy, but that does include PV operations and maintenance. FEMP also has an operations and maintenance team, specific program focused on that. And I would encourage the person asking the question to reach out to the general FEMP assistant, and I can put that link in the chat as well.
Terrific. I think that's about all the questions that we have time for today. We really appreciate all of you coming. Nicole, do you have anything further to say on behalf of FEMP?
I would just like to thank the presenters and everyone for attending. This has really been a fantastic webinar, and I hope that it was valuable to you, and best of luck with maintaining and operating your systems.
All right, with that, thanks very much for your attendance, and we'll be following up with an email. It'll include a survey that helps us understand what you need. We're going to be asking, just a brief question about what other types of trainings or resources you would like to see available. Take a moment, if you would, to fill that out. And I think we said a couple times in chat, we will be providing the slides and at some point a link to the recording. All right, with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.